Welcome to Instadeath Survivor Support Group, a podcast all about game books and the readers and writers who adore them. Today on the show, we have Oliver Hulme, co-director of Spidermind Games. Oliver is the author of the Legendary Kingdom series. Book 2 of the series, Crown and Tower, is currently on Kickstarter. The campaign has already raised over $150,000 and will end on April 15th. Oliver will tell us what it takes to run a successful Kickstarter, what it's like to work with top-tier artists, and how he has developed the world and characters in his Legendary Kingdom series. Oliver, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
So the Kickstarter for Book 2 of Legendary Kingdoms, Crown and Tower, is live right now, and it's doing really well. As of the time of this recording, it's raised over $150,000 and has over 2,200 backers. As the author, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm really, really pleased for it to do so well. The long and short is we're extremely happy. We had a sense as we were leading up to the Kickstarter that it was going to do quite well. But by quite well, we thought about half what we've got, was kind of like the figure that was going through our minds. So this is really, really amazing. And it's only just started. So it's given us a real buzz. And hopefully we'll be able to sort of advertise out to even more people before the end of the Kickstarter. So yeah, we're really, really pleased about it.
I imagine a lot of hard work has gone into this launch. To what do you owe the success of the Kickstarter?
Well, it doesn't exist in isolation. Obviously, first you need a good product, but so many people have good products out there. That's far from unique to Spidermind. We've also got an amazing designer called Bruce Kennedy, and he's responsible for the arrangement of our graphics and so forth. A lot of the images that you see were created by a guy called Claudio Piglia, who he's one of the Game of Thrones artists. So he sort of does the background scenery. He's a concept artist for them. So one of his most famous ones, Dragonstone, is his. So if you remember, that's like big castle from season 7, roughly. Also, the kind of cartoony black and white stuff. If you recognize the style, it's because it's by Judge Dredd artist Robin Smith. So, he's kind of, agreed to work on all of our books, which is like, completely amazing for me. So, and lastly, of course, we've got a team of advertisers called Graceled, and they helped us with our very successful Level Up Kickstarter. They're just really good at getting the word out. They're very dedicated. And so, and for all of the influencers and so forth who've picked this up and sort of gone with it, it's all obviously paid dividends. So, obviously, thank you to everyone. Yeah, it's not just that we're really clever. There's lots of people work to make this a success.
You talked about the amazing artists you work with, and obviously it's paid off. The art in the books is mind-blowingly good. How was it collaborating with these top-tier talented artists?
Well, they're brilliant. These ones, we were incredibly lucky with both. With Claudio, it was a complete accident. We didn't know about his history with Game of Thrones. We were after Robin Smith, a brilliant interior illustrator, and he's a great designer of comic book style art, but he was never going to be able to do the cover for us. But I was going for something quite mature and grown up, and actually, ironically, with a Game of Thrones-y kind of feel. And I went on a site called, it's got a dreadful name, but it is honestly just like a regular art site called DeviantArt, and it's where all sorts of artists put their work. And I came across this picture, which you see on the front cover of Book 1, The Valley of Bones, which was this desert city. And it just looked gorgeous. It was pretty much exactly as I imagined my City of Salt there to be. I said, I'll have that one, please. And when we went into negotiations, Claudio was brilliant. We just said that, this is for a game book, so it wasn't going to be for a very big audience, but could we have his art, please? And he let us have it for a fairly low sum, but said afterwards, if you want another picture, just let me know, because he was quite excited by it. And we really only clocked who he was when we were paying his invoice, and looked him up on his website and thought, oh my God, he was... he did Game of Thrones. And yeah, working with him was dead easy. The main one, which he did bespoke for us, because Book 1 was just a modified version of an existing image. Book 2, he worked with us with all the medieval heraldry, with the design of the kind of the sea moat that surrounds the city. I had a very clear idea about how I wanted the castle to look. People have a bit of a mistaken idea about how castles look in medieval times, because they look at how castles look now and they imagine, well, that's how castles looked in the past. They're kind of grey and washed out and they're slightly crumbly. And of course, these things were all brand new. And actually, when Henry V invaded Harfleur, the writers were describing how the city of Harfleur, which is really what Longport Bay is slightly based on, the city walls were like painted a cobalt blue with kind of banners draped all the way around with every single noble house that was in there. And even the ships, when they were going on a ship, the ships are bedecked in kind of shields and crests and flags. And, the ships weren't brown like we have ships nowadays. They were painted red and scarlet and everything was quite vibrant. We pulled back on the idea of painting the walls blue because I think it would put people off just a bit too much. It's a bit like if in Jurassic Park they have the dinosaurs with feathers on, even though dinosaurs probably had feathers. We know that now. But if they did that in Jurassic Park, people go, what on earth is that? That's not a T-Rex. It's kind of, that's a bird, and so kind of a bit like that. We got rid of the colors on the walls, but I really want to keep like all the banners and the districts and the ward gates and so forward, and just the physical kind of fortifications and the way that outside the city, there's nothing. It's fields. These days, cities have slums or they have kind of suburbs that go on for miles outside the city gates. With early medieval stuff, you built the city walls and everything crammed into that. Because if there's an invasion, if you're on the wrong side of the city wall, you're just going to get looted by the armies that are popping up and burning everything to the ground, which is why sort of, Longport is incredibly crammed. Everything is packed into this tight area in it. So, yeah, he did really well. There was never a moment's bother, and it's the same with Robin. He's been a professional artist his whole life. And so when you want redraws, when you want like little changes, he does it in his sleep. It's amazing, really. Just a great privilege to see kind of, how artists interpret your work. And, you write something down. I try not to change too much. If I give someone a commission, I don't endlessly make them go back and change it. I like to see how people have created it, because that shows me the kind of images that my words are making. This project, it's been delightful because there's been very little ego to have to deal with, only my own.
I think that perhaps there are listeners who haven't been following Legendary Kingdoms. So let's go back to the basics with this. Legendary Kingdoms is an open world series. Other popular open world series include Steam Highwayman and, of course, Fabled Lands. And before I ask, the obvious question, which is what makes Legendary Kingdoms different, I'm curious, what do you think the book shares in common with other open world series?
It totally stands on the shoulders of giants. I'm not going to tell you that this is a totally original work. In terms of, it's clearly its biggest influence is the Fabled Lands. It takes, for instance, its basic structure, which is the idea that each book is an area of land. So it's an area of the world, and you go from place to place, and you can do it in any order. That thrust is taken. There's also some of the clever little things that Dave Morris and Jamie Thompson did, which is the code word system so that people remember what you were doing. I've changed it slightly so it's no longer code words you're writing down, but kind of like code numbers. But it's the same basic premise. And just a genius idea of where there's an item you can pick up, you put it in bold, which is incredibly simple, but it just means that when you're looting monsters, you can see exactly what it is you can take and what's the difference between just descriptive text and what's an actual item that's usable in the game. So all of that is taken, but it goes way, way deeper than that. I mean, I think that there's structural parts of the game which are quite similar to Steve Jackson's sorcery system, certainly in terms of the comparative rarity of magic and its kind of its specialness. And also the idea of the secret mega quest in the books is a lot more kind of a sorcery than it is a Fabled Lands. Fabled Lands, you wander anywhere you like, but there's no great super plot. It's just whatever journey you want to do. This one, there is technically an end if you want there to be, but it's kind of hidden away in a corner somewhere. But there's numerous things. If I wanted to go into super detail, the idea that armies fight each other is from Duel Master, which was from the 1980s. Pretty sure Dave Morris had something to do with that. If not, it would have been Jamie Thompson. Those guys, they stole all the best ideas, basically, and, left us with nothing. But, that kind of idea, the idea of armies fighting has been done before. But what hasn't been done before is the idea that you can raise armies and then they can, follow you to other books. And that's a unique idea for Legendary Kingdoms. So, you name it. So Legendary Kingdoms is either based off it, it's pinched it. But I try to I like to think it's inspiration rather than just basic stealing. And there are some unique ideas as well in Legendary Kingdoms too.
Yeah, a couple of things I noticed, whereas in Fabled Lands, the introductory section of a book is kind of one paragraph or one section, I should say. You've gone very deep with the introductory section, at least in the first book. It's kind of an adventure in and of itself. In fact, it probably could have been published as a game book on its own, right? Does that continue with the other books? Do you have unique introductions for each of the books planned?
Yes, absolutely. Each book has a big introduction. I like to establish setting very quickly. One of the things about book one is that it's a savage Conan the Barbarian style world where, steel is more important than people and barbaric kings are ruling everywhere. Book two, for instance, it's not too much of a spoiler to say that you end up in the middle of a riot. So the conflict between two noble houses has, for all intents and purposes, created social instability. And you enter a city that's kind of, breaking down. And likewise, book three will have its own special introduction, and book four. They're great introductions to new players, and each book, I feel, has to stand alone because I don't know what order someone is going to buy Legendary Kingdoms. I can't just assume, book one. Everyone, of course, will start with book one, and most people will. But there's always going to be some, if this book ends up in a bookshop, and the only one left is book three, and they go, oh yeah, that looks good. They have to be able to play book three just with that, and then later get obsessed and buy all the others. But those introductions aren't wasted. It's not that you can only play those intros if you're starting first time. So, for instance, what most people know, say that the arena sequence in book one, where you get to fight in this arena and escape, you can encounter that even if you began, say, in book two, sail to book one. If you're unlucky enough to be enslaved and end up in the Saltdown arena, you will go through that arena sequence. So, that story isn't wasted. And likewise in book two, you sail across, if you've played book one, you're sailing across the seas to Longport Bay. The first thing you encounter is that there's a riot happening. Now, you can ignore it because you're on your ship and sail away and let the riot peter out, in which case it'll disappear and you don't have to play it. But no, you can go in and you can experience the opening section of book two. The only slight difference is that there's a little more hand-holding when you play a Legendary Kingdoms book for the first time. So you're given special missions to kind of guide you on your way. If you're coming from other books, there's a little bit less than that because you're experienced adventurers by now. You know how it works. So I think those intro adventures are important to just develop theme and the feel of the book.
Another difference that's impossible not to notice is that, in most game books, the reader embodies a you in quotes, right? It's kind of a second person blank canvas as a main character. And Legendary Kingdoms takes a similar approach, except the player controls a party of 4 adventurers. Why did you choose to go that route?
So the idea behind Legendary Kingdoms is I wanted it to be like a game book campaign. What I wanted to capture was the kind of Dungeons and Dragons games that I used to run. A thing that some people know about me is that I began doing Dungeons and Dragons adventures very, very young. So I was 9 years old when I was recruited as the games master for a bunch of much bigger boys who sort of came around the house and sort of bullied me in that nice way that, big boys do into being their dungeon master because they all wanted to play. They didn't want to mess around creating the stories. They left me to do that. But I obviously had great fun with it and I took to it and, it was nice to be in charge of, a much more important, kind of older boys. So, I always had a very high opinion of D&D and I wanted to show the kind of adventures that I created. I want to show my D&D campaigns and, these books are largely the stories that I've already told that, kind of people in my family and my friends have already played. And I kind of wanted to share it with the world. You can't really capture that sense of kind of party dynamics without having a party of adventurers. People are used to a party of adventurers. I think in a lot of role-playing games, it's standard that, it's not just you, it's a bunch of adventurers. There's no one particular you. You are many different characters, whether it's the Baldur's Gate style games or Baltimore or, much more recent stuff. I thought the party dynamic was interesting because it it allows you to kind of like explore party building, which I think is more interesting than just focusing on a single character. It also means you don't have to have all your eggs in one basket. When you're making a character in an RPG, often it's a case of, well, this time I'll be a fighter. This time I'm going to be kind of like a wizardy type. I'm going to be a sneaky, thiefy type person this time. But really what people really want is they want to have kind of like all of those sorts of things. At least, that's what I reckon. And, people are buying my book, so I must be right. I think it makes for an interesting game book. The only game books that I'm aware of that have done the same, and apologies if I've missed some out, but I'm aware that the Blood Sword books first created party dynamics, but again, they were fixed adventures. The first one was a dungeon adventure, book 3 was a wilderness adventure, and the final book is you're going to the evil castle, trying to sort of defeat the big bad. This one is combining both party and open world, and it's quite interesting. And I hope people will enjoy the adventures that it allows me to create with it.
You mentioned that you like to establish setting early in the books. Can you tell us how you approached world building for Legendary Kingdoms?
Well, partly I cheated because a lot of the world was already built. What Legendary Kingdoms is that it's a mashup of lots of different campaigns that I ran growing up. The Valley of Bones are created in the very early 2000s. And in fairness, it's before I saw Game of Thrones, but I appreciate there's a kind of a Daenerys Targaryen-esque thing going on. I don't want to spoil too much. Yeah, that culture had already been written, and those kind of 5 different cities. The main direction I went with the Valley of Bones is, what was it like 1,000 years ago before it fell? What kind of culture was that? What is it like now? One thing I really like about Valley of Bones in particular is that it was a very cosmopolitan society before it collapsed. So there are many different kinds of people who lived there. And so, there are kind of like there's like a Japanese like kind of city. There's one which is very kind of almost like sort of like Norse barbarian, and the rest are kind of were quite similar to like medieval Spain. And they all interacted together, all these 5 different cities ruled by powerful immortals, and then it all just went flat. But it left a large number of different peoples kind of running around and intermixing. And so it's quite a vibrant place. Book 2 is almost the total tonal opposite. It's a monoculture, where it's effectively, kind of a white European culture, which is entirely insular and obsessed with small things for the most part. So rather than having all these different peoples interacting, many people don't go 5 minutes from their village. And in fact, book 2 is the most recent campaign I'm running, which I call my Royce campaign. The Royce is the kingdom which Longport Bay is kind of part of. So that one is very fresh in my mind at the moment. And it's the area which my players are, kind of knocking around in at the moment. Very high medieval, very restrictive. So, for instance, commoners can't walk freely in Longport Bay. So in book 2, if you don't have a lord with you, then you're literally not allowed abroad unless you have a written right from a noble that says you can go out. So it's the polar opposite of book 1, where anyone can go anywhere and do anything. And there's very few laws, to a place which is kind of quite constraining in a way. But obviously it's much richer. It's much more developed. And if you stick to the civilized areas, it's much less dangerous than book 1. But the actual dangerous bits of book 2 are, of course, a little bit more hazardous, a bit more tough to get into. And beyond that, the same approach was kind of taken with all the different areas. The Splintered Isles are Thalcia, which I had in one campaign, and there's the Savage Lands. I don't want to give too much away with, but they're all from different campaigns of mine. They're all pre-built. There's one exception, which is Drake Hallow, which is going to be the final book in the series. I'm building Drake Hallow as I go through kind of like your rumor and dropping things, kind of like little secrets. Very, very basically, one thing I do know about it is that it's kind of like, it's a bit like steampunk China for all intents and purposes, and kind of China in the modern world, where it's industrialized very rapidly. They're facing the consequences of such rapid improvement, on what impact that has on their society and who've been left behind. So, I kind of like to think I've saved the best till last, but I like all the books individually. Yeah, with my world building, I cheated because I've already done it. As anyone who's done a D&D campaign, your worlds, evolve kind of, very, very naturally. You start off with one key idea, this is Conan the Barbarian, and then you just develop those individual bits from there and draw things out. And that's how I did it.
Stay tuned, survivors. There's more to the episode after these brief messages. If you're hearing this, it means you're on the free stream of the podcast, and I'm so glad you're here discovering the world of game books with me. This show is made possible by the support of listeners like you. If you'd like to support the podcast, head over to patreon.com/instadeath. Survivor-level supporters get ad-free episodes up to a week earlier, with as much as 10 minutes of bonus content per episode. And of course, my gratitude for helping me survive this wacky adventure. We'll be right back to the episode after this sponsored message. So you've built this rich world, and obviously players are going to get to experience more and more of it with each book. But obviously this isn't a novel, it's a game, right? So that's the way that we get to interact with the world. Let's talk about the game systems in Legendary Kingdom.
Okay, so there's lots of different systems. The first thing I think to say about Legendary Kingdoms is that its scope is very broad. For the most part, it's a party adventuring game, much as you have in regular RPGs. But also, you can go aboard ships and kind of sail around the world. That's very big in Book 3. And also, you can raise armies and they can fight. And each of those has a different combat system. So they're linked. So there's similarities kind of between them. Yeah, so there's different ways to fight according to whether you're on a ship, whether you're the small group, or whether you're in an army. Obviously, as we've discussed before, it's a party-based system, and there's kind of like, you have inventories of stuff to manage. With the party-based fighting, one of the big things about it is that it's very tactical. It's a very tactical way of fighting. It's not like fighting fantasy where basically, you roll 2 dice, you've got to sort of beat your opponent's score and then you do some damage. It's all about trying to identify who the biggest threat to your party is, trying to eliminate them first, and then coping with the disasters that come your way during the enemy turn. A big thing that you can do in Legendary Kingdoms is that when monsters hit you, you can decide who they hit. So you decide which party member is taking the blows. That's not accidental, and the game book is absolutely designed around it, because if you assign that damage randomly, especially some of the tougher fights, you would die in short order. It absolutely encourages this idea of party tanks who are extremely well armored and they can absorb hits. But you're often pushed into situations where, for instance, let's say you've got Jessica Dane in your party. She's got a nice high armor score, say of 5. But she's only got 3 health points left, and someone's just done 4 points of damage. Now, she's got enough armor, potentially, to absorb that. But armor doesn't always work. You make a roll, and for every die you roll for your armor, 4, 5, 6, you ignore a point. So, Jessica, even though she's got the best armor, she might get killed if you assign her that damage. On the other hand, you might have a character with almost no armor, and 4 damage is like half their health just wiped out in one. So you're constantly having to make these decisions about, where I spread out the damage, where that's going, who's the most risky monster to leave alive and so forward. And, just in a larger sense as your kind of party building, who should be the warriors? Who should I focus on to be my stealth experts? And even such things as whether you should have stealth experts. There's a thing in Legendary Kingdoms, it's a mean trick that I'm constantly playing, but it's part of the design. Your party doesn't stay as a single homogeneous group. You're not always in one blob, you're often split. And sometimes you get to decide how you split. So, you've got a situation of where, say, someone's being mugged in an alley, and, a house is on fire and there's children stuck in it. To go and save both those people, how are you going to split your party? There you might decide, well, I'll have the fighty people, they'll go off and help the person being mugged, and the people who can climb and have got high survival skills can go and help the kids. But sometimes you don't get a choice. And, I'll just say in the text, right, pick a character. Just pick a character and then turn to this reference number, and you don't know what's going to happen. Is that character going to have their pocket picked? Is a portcullis going to slam behind them? They're permanently separated. When your party members get separated, that's when you kind of wish that your party were generalists rather than just specialists. And that, it's fine to have one person who's just brilliant at stealth. But if that person is busy, they're off somewhere else and everyone else needs, you need at least one redundant character. And as you go through the books, You're going to want to spread your skills around as much as you can. And one of the main ways that the games build in difficulty isn't just because the monsters get physically tougher. It's the challenges I set you get harder. The decisions you have to make are trickier. And in book 2, you'll see that fairly early on as you're making harder decisions about how the party splits. That's only going to get worse as you go on. So, you can never completely rest on your laurels in Legendary Kingdoms. You've got to make sure that your party can kind of handle everything. And it's incumbent on you to buy things to do that, take on quests that you think you can handle, and all that kind of magic stuff that, RPGs do.
So your campaign for Crown and Tower, which is the second book of Legendary Kingdoms, is among the most successful for game books that I've seen in recent years. I can only think of 2 others that have had a similar level of success, and that's Alba by Inside the Box Board Games and the graphic novel adventure series by Van Ryder Games. What do you think the role of these larger, more successful titles like Legendary Kingdoms and the others is in the game books market?
I think there's an element of responsibility for this new wave of game books to just do things really well. We're kind of at this crux point where people are getting back into the idea of game books again. And so those ones which, are looking to be successful, they've got a bit of a burden to bear, because I think, and this is a big thing with Legendary Kingdoms, I wanted to show what a game book could do. People have very fixed ideas about what game books were for understandable reasons. The game books were written for children in the 1980s, so they weren't too complicated. They had very simple plots and very simple mechanisms. And that idea sort of carried on, even though game book creators tried to break out of that. There were a number of spirited attempts as we sort of came into even in the late 80s and the 90s to sort of make game books a bit more complex. But really, the publishers weren't having any of it. It's a great miracle, for instance, that we ever got Fabled Lands, which, is kind of, was one of the most complex ones. That was invented in the late 90s. But now we've got crowdfunding systems. We can make the games that we want. And I think we have to show that it's worth people's time. So for just a bit, they've got to be quite ambitious and kind of quite special. And, all of those titles that you mentioned have aspects of that. Alba being one of the very few post-apocalyptic game books we have. I mean, if you discount Freeway Fighter from Fighting Fancy all the way back in the 80s, which incidentally I love. You should play that. So yeah, there is a burden of responsibility. And I think maybe one of the reasons why Legendary Kingdoms kind of tries to do so much is because I wanted to accept that mantle, to make it, just the biggest, best thing that I could visualize. It needs to be ambitious so that people realize that as an art form, it has value. Because I would say that the way I always see game books and this argument that video games destroyed game books is a bit like this. I think if you consider poetry in the 18th century was enormous. There were all these poetry books being made, and you had Swift and that gang making, kind of all their little books, and they were sold like hotcakes. And one of the nice things about poetry was that poetry books could be quite slim, quite small, because printing was really expensive in the 18th century. It was difficult. When you came to the 19th century, suddenly you had like Dickens and kind of, Henry James and that crew, and they made books that were like, huge door stoppers, about 1 million pages long. And they became, the new big thing. And that was because printing became super cheap. And novels, you were more approachable than poetry. You didn't have to be quite as smart or profound to understand it. And, it was, nectar for the masses. And suddenly, all these great poets, the 19th century, they were kind of taking a bit of a hit. It's the novelists who were making all the money. But that didn't mean that poetry was suddenly rubbish. That poetry no longer had a value. Poems are still great unto themselves. And I think it's the same thing with game books and video games. I think both can kind of learn from each other. Video games are one thing, but they're terribly expensive to make. I deliberately made Legendary Kingdoms to be one of those things that if you ever want to turn it into a video game, you'll just go bust. You'd need, the Total War kind of, combat system. You'd need, sailing systems from Assassin's Creed, Black Flag, and you'd, kind of need an RPG systems like Baldur's Gate 3. It would bankrupt any studio that wanted to make it. And there's just things you can do in game books you just realistically can't do. In video games, inference and the ability to kind of break systems halfway through. So, if in, Dishonored, they want you to be able to jump on a chandelier and swing to the other side of a hall in the middle of a fight while saying something heroic to someone, that's like a million hours work. You've got, kind of teams of artists that have to work on it and get the physics of the chandelier just right. I just have to write it. And, suddenly it's there and, it will appear. And more besides. I'd like to think that by the end of Legendary Kingdoms, you played all 6 books, you'll think, well, actually, yeah, this has been an adventure that is unique, that could never have been done in a video game setting. Because I think that's needed in the same way as you need just an amazing, actor to really kick it in theatre to show that movies can't have their way all the time. It has to be the same with the game books. And yeah, when I look at things like Steam Highwaymen and so forward, and even like Destiny Quest, for instance, they're epic game books in themselves that you start off like as a peasant, but fairly soon you're saving the world. There's an energy about them, which it was just very contagious for making my own stuff. So yes, I'm very hopeful that there might be a bit of a continued run with these things.
I know you're also a game book fan yourself. So I'm curious, putting you on the spot, do you have a favorite game book of all time?
Can I cheat by saying that I have a favorite game book series, and I've touched on it before, which is the Sorcery series. And for those who love Lone Wolf, I love it too. It's brilliant. But the Sorcery series is a thing that I return to at the very least once a decade. And I set myself various challenges. Sorcery is by Steve Jackson, and basically it's the Lord of the Rings of the fighting fantasy world. It is an epic quest where you're given a big world map, and you start off in the very bottom left corner, and you got to get to the top right corner, to the fortress of Mampang, where the Crown of Kings has been captured by this evil archmage. But you don't do it in a single book. It's a 4-book epic where you're slowly crawling across the map from one place to the next before you finally confront with the archmage and try and get the crown back. It's very difficult. Book 1 is fairly easy, but after that, they all become classic fighting fantasy fare, where if, you make a wrong turn, you're basically dead type situation. So, when you're playing it through as a campaign, one book leads to the next, you can be doing really well, and then you're killed by a wraith, or you make a wrong turn, you're praying in a temple, the temple collapses on top of you, and you're dead, and you've got to start from the beginning again. It's a real challenge, but more than that, there's something about the setting and the art, which is incredibly compelling. It was based on Steve Jackson, I believe. He was going around a South Asian country just filled with temples and strangeness. He based his book on that, and then he got an artist called John Blanche, who's most famous for Warhammer 40,000 and sort of illustrating all the craziness, especially the stuff in the 90s for that. And, everything is kind of crooked and bizarre and weird in Sorcery. You're a wizard in it, but you have to physically remember your spells. There's a spell list of different spells. They've all got code words in it, like hot is a fireball and dop lets you open doors for some reason. And all these different sort of codes. And then you're never allowed to look at the spellbook again. You begin your quest, you get through 4 spellbooks just on your pure memory. And Steve Jackson did it on the criticism of Dungeons and Dragons, whereby when a wizard casts a spell, he used to forget it. So early versions of D&D, you'd memorize 3 magic missiles, 1 sleep spell. If you cast your sleep spell, it's gone for the day. And a lot of people thought, that's ridiculous. How can a wizard forget their spells? Well, Steve Jackson showed you how a wizard could forget his spells, because there were 48 of those buggers. And, trying to remember them all was practically impossible. But I think I do know them all now, because I played those books so many times. And when, they were redone by, a studio called Inkle, who remade all the Sorcery books. They did a fantastic conversion. They actually even added to the lore, which was brilliant. It's written into my soul. I played it as recently as a few years ago. And I won that time, which was great. And I remember played through and won on a minimum stat roll, just deliberately to see if I could do it. And yes, there's that tricky bit in book 2, but I got through it through sheer luck. and managed to complete the books. And I love them. Their setting, their mechanics, and their writing, I think it's brilliant. And as much as I do admire the amazing advances that kind of Morris and Thompson did in their various years, I'll always love Sorcery the best. And I love you too, Ian Livingston. I didn't shun you. Love Death Trap Dungeon. Thought it was great.
And there's been many more years since for more and more advancements. Legendary Kingdoms is now taking its place in that. What do you think the future holds for game books?
I don't know. I hope they just continue, and it becomes part of the furniture again. I don't want to go too moralistic, but I think they're just so good for kids. Not that I wrote Legendary Kingdoms for kids. 14 plus preferably. But, I think they're so good for literacy, for imagination. They're such great stepping stones into kind of, RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. There's something about the restriction of the format that can make it great, which kind of flies in the face sometimes of, and I say this having created a massive open world, and I admit it's a little bit hypocritical of me, but sometimes just restrictions when you're creating an art form can bring out the best in you. And it's a case of it does force you as a designer when you're setting up situations. What would I do in this situation? What are the realistic options that I would do, what other people might think of doing? And don't just list things that people wouldn't do. Don't put down things like, you bump into an orc and then you challenge them to a game of dice or something just super quirky. Stick to the things that, might realistically work so that the choices when they're making them are genuinely difficult. It's a great format for that and just kind of, refining your ideas. So I hope that they just continue, and they don't have to be anything like mine. But honestly, you want to make your massive 6-world campaign thing, by all means do it. But game books don't have to be that. They could also be simple, as much as complicated. Just spread the love, make more of them. So that, when I'm an old man and, my nephew, has, or my, great nephew or whatever, has a game book there, I'm not suddenly thrown by it. I can die a happy man, if it's been, I'm one of the people who's brought it back.
Great. Well, Oliver, it's been brilliant talking to you today about game books and your Legendary Kingdoms series, and of course, Crown and Tower, now on Kickstarter today. For those listeners who want to get their hands on the books, what's the best thing that they should do to get the Legendary Kingdoms series?
We've got a free download that you can play. So of book 1, which is available on, it's actually available on the Kickstarter page, but you'll find it on spidermindgames.co.uk. You could try and buy book 1. I think they've mostly sold out, but we are printing more. They're really difficult to get their hands on. I think we've got another 1,000 shipping to America at the moment, and we will print another bunch as well over in the United States to try and, kind of reduce the terrible transport difficulties that everyone's suffering from at the moment. So you might be able to find some. I think there might still be some copies in Britain. There might be some American ones. They might be already by the time you listen to this. So give it a try. Otherwise, in the Kickstarter, you can get them a bit cheaper than on standard retail. So do backers. Get book 2 while you're at it. Honestly, if you like book 1, you'll love book 2. It's all part of the same stable. And the more books you have with Legendary Kingdoms, the more fun it gets because it's more areas of the world that you can run around in.
Yeah, and of course, if collecting is your thing, now's your chance to get the beautiful hardcover bound versions of the books right on the Kickstarter. Yeah. When this episode goes live, we should be about halfway through the campaign, maybe about 2 weeks left. So get in there. What do you know? What is the final day for the Kickstarter campaign?
Thursday, April 15th.
Well, thanks again, Oliver.
No problem. And thank you very much for having me on.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the show, become a patron at patreon.com/instadeath. A special thanks to our guests and to the contributors who help make the show better than I ever could on my own. intro music graciously provided by Jesse Johnson, aka Zenoda. Find more great music by searching Jesse Johnson or Zenoda, spelled with an X, on YouTube and most major streaming platforms. Podcast cover art generously contributed by Patrick O'Neill. You can learn more about Pat's art on his Facebook page, Pat O'Neill Art.